Hello, my name is Joseph De La Sala, and I'm joined by Max Schonenfeld. In this podcast, we will be talking about greenhouse gases and how transportation and greenhouse gases are contributing to climate change. We will also have some very special guests joining us today on our podcast.
Greenhouse gases are gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect by absorbing infrared radiation and keeping them in our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and methane are two of the main gases. They contribute to the greenhouse effect greatly, which in turn heats up the Earth. Sources are things that produce greenhouse gases, while sinks are things that absorb greenhouse gases. The reason that this problem is starting to get more drastic is because the sources now outweigh the sinks. One large contributor is transportation and motorized vehicles. They produce 28% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. It's the largest contributor of greenhouse emissions in the US. Passenger cars and light-duty trucks account for half of greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. The average number of vehicles per household in New York stands at 0.6. However, for the rest of the United States, the average is currently at 2.05. This is because in New York, they have a great public transportation system with 472 subways and 5,710 buses, with a total ridership of 2.4 million average weekday and 764 million annually in 2016. Buses are extremely accessible because there are 16,350 total bus stops. However, other alternatives include walking or taking a bike. New York has a great city bike program that makes it so that people can easily get a bike in order to go from destination to destination and then drop it off. Another alternative are electric cars. Sales have risen 74% from 2017 due to a tax break that was made on March 21st.
A common debate that currently comes up while discussing climate change is adaptation opposed to mitigation. Max and I are both heavy advocates for mitigation, however, believe that we must also adapt because climate change will not end with the snap of a finger.
Okay, I'm here with John Oliveira, science teacher at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, and so we're going to ask him a few questions about climate change and how it may affect us in New York specifically. So what are your concerns about carbon emissions, and how do you think climate change will affect us over the next few years?
I think that in New York, as a coastal city, our biggest problem would be flooding anywhere that the city is close to sea level or anywhere closer to water. Also, air quality in a dense urban environment is something that we have to constantly worry about. It's a big concern for a lot of other cities like Los Angeles or Shanghai. And as a population that's very dense, we emit a lot of carbon. So it's something that we need to be more wary of as a city.
So what are your ideas and suggestions on how to decrease greenhouse emissions, specifically more in our school community?
Well, in our school community, I think one of the things we could do is become a zero-waste school. We're working towards that by getting rid of plastic straws. We could also focus more on composting organic material and then using that compost maybe for some other purpose, forming some sort of school garden or maybe contributing to a community garden. I think that we could potentially, and I know cost is a factor, but installing solar panels to help alleviate our reliance on normal electricity. There's a lot we can be doing as a community.
What transportation do you typically take?
I usually take the subway, sometimes the bus, mostly the subway though.
Do you ever actively monitor your carbon emissions or do anything conscious of that, and if so, how?
That's a good question. I'm probably not as conscious about that stuff as I could be. I try to carry a recyclable water bottle, not use a lot of plastic. I bring reusable bags to the grocery store. But these are all kind of minor individual activities. I've attended climate rallies. I've donated to the NRDC, written to and called politicians and our representatives. But these are they feel like individual things. It would be better to kind of have community action.
And as you previously said, we should really be worried because we're a coastal city in New York. But what do you think we can do in order, specifically us, in order to either mitigate or adapt to climate change?
So I think we need to be focused more on the mitigation aspect because in New York we haven't had to adapt too much quite yet, although there are some instances where we have. We could take a page from a lot of cities over in Europe, a lot of places that are kind of on the more of the cutting edge of using green energy, using offshore wind farms. We can probably have a solar farm outside of the city that we float electricity to into the city. Make more, within the city, have more green roofs, which would be like little gardens on top of roofs. That would kind of eliminate a lot of the absorption of like black tar on roofs and let people kind of grow their own food. And it would also, in its own small way, remove carbon out of the air. Yeah, I think those are the kind of the things we can do.
Next, zooming more out on like America as a whole, what steps do you think we should take in order to combat climate change?
Step one is re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement and agreeing to go back to the promises that we made to other countries when we signed up for that, and it's really difficult being the only Western nation that's not involved with that. It's kind of embarrassing. Also, reestablishing the EPA as an actual environmental protection agency instead of the massive deregulations that are going on across the board. It's kind of frustrating looking at it from a macro perspective as a country right now. It feels like we're having an uphill battle.
Finally, what do you think makes mitigation so much better? And like, what are the pros and cons for this? Like, what do you think makes it so much better than adaptation?
So if we're adapting, we're changing ourselves to fit the problem. And as the problem changes, we're changing. And if the problem gets worse, we adapt to it. Mitigation is putting a stop to it. Sometimes it's slow, but it would allow us to change climate change and alter what's happening as opposed to just adapting to a situation that's getting worse and worse.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Our second guest is Miss Carlin. She is a science teacher at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, who is the head of the Climate Change Division. What are your concerns about carbon emission, and how do you think climate change will affect us over the next few years?
Us in New York? Or
Yeah, specifically
like
in New York.
In New York. I think I can't, what aren't my concerns? I think that climate change is a really major issue, and I try and maintain my optimism because the alternative of what I really feel is not as useful to solving any sort of problems. But I've really been concerned ever since I learned about climate change for the first time, which was like late high school, early college. And it's really only gotten worse. I think my biggest concern is that we're not going to make the changes that are necessary in time for them to make any sort of real impact. I'd say that's probably my biggest concern. I think that climate change is related to so many major issues, and that's why I see it as kind of the biggest problem that we face right now, because it's related to war and famine and water shortages and a whole other slew of political tensions. And I feel like it's all kind of connected to having a healthy environment and a stable climate.
How big of a role do you think that transportation, motorized vehicles, play in like the general picture of climate change, especially, but like also zoomed in on New York?
Yeah, so as far as transportation, I think that that's a major sector as far as where the emissions are coming from. I think the major sectors that are producing the carbon emissions are industry and factories, transportation, agriculture. And so having like a really solid public transit system is great in New York. I think, likely because New York is mostly a city at sea level, we're going to have to consider like refurbishing or reworking our whole transit system, raising roads the way that they do in Miami, strengthening our subway system. But all of those things cost so much money that I don't really know what that would look like in the future.
Do you ever make like self-conscious decisions like yourself, like thinking about climate change, like in your like daily actions?
Literally every day. Yeah. No longer, I do have an air conditioner in my apartment, but I lived for 3 or 4 years without an air conditioner because I didn't want to be putting that strain on the environment. Every time I buy something, I consider, can I get these clothes or something similar at a thrift shop and reuse, or is it something that's, necessary to buy new? When I'm finished using something, I always think, is there a way to reuse this material? I try and purchase local food as often as possible to minimize that impact. My biggest personal carbon impact is traveling and flights and everything like that. In fact, actually last period, I just did carbon footprint calculations with my class, and my carbon footprint was like half that of an average American until we got to the very last question, which was about how many flights do you take? And then I actually went up to 1.3 times the amount of a carbon footprint that an average American has. So, I try to offset that as much as possible.
And then what's your like stance on like adaptation to mitigation?
Both. I think that I hope, I don't think there's really much scientific backing for this yet, but I hope that we are still at a point where collective societal changes can lessen the impact of climate change. I think that, because of feedback loops, it's inevitable that even if we completely stopped producing any of our carbon emissions, we'd still see changes. But I do think that there's still some hope to decrease or diminish the impact of those climate changes. That said, I think it's very realistic to move forward thinking about how to adapt and how to kind of live in this new world of a changed climate.
And then lastly, just what is your stance on electric cars and
Before I moved to New York, I had a Prius. So yes, I like electric cars. The thing about electric cars is that, it requires a lot of energy and electricity to make them. And so that kind of offsets for a while the impact of actually just having an electric car, but they have to be the way of the future. Especially in a place like America where most people in America have it's like one car per person. It's not like it's just so prevalent.
All right, thank you. All right, that is all the time we have today. I would just like to say thank you again to both of our guest speakers. And we hope that we have educated the people listening to this podcast. Until next time, Max and Joey.